April 24th, 2012. Someone creates a Gmail account. Username, John Smith. The address, industryconfessions@gmail.com. They write a message. The subject line reads, "The secret meeting that changed rap music and destroyed a generation." They hit send. The email describes a meeting, early 1990s, a private residence on the outskirts of Los Angeles. A small group of music industry insiders invited without being told why. Then a man, introduced only by his first name, stands up and starts talking. He says their employers have become silent investors in private prisons. He says it is now in their interest to make sure those prisons stay full. And he says their job, starting now, is to make music that makes that happen. Rap music, specifically. The room goes quiet. Then someone shouts. Two men move toward him. The meeting gets chaotic. And then, according to the letter, over the months that follow, the music changes. The email spreads across every hip-hop blog on the internet. Hundreds of thousands of people read it. Some believe it, some don't. Nobody ever finds out who wrote it. Nobody ever proves the meeting happened. But here's the thing about this story. You don't need the meeting. This is Backroom. How the music industry helped fill America's prisons. Today we're going inside the machine that linked hip-hop and mass incarceration in America, whether anyone planned it or not. Before we get to the music, we need to understand the business. Because what happened to hip-hop in the 1990s didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened inside a specific economic system, one that had been built piece by piece over the previous decade. And it started with a sentence in the U.S. Constitution. The 13th Amendment was ratified in 1865. It abolished slavery. Most people know that part. Fewer people read the full text. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States. Except as a punishment for crime. That exception has never been closed. It is still in the Constitution today. By the 1970s, something new was being built on top of it. Prison privatization. Governments were spending enormous sums housing inmates. Private companies pitched a simpler model. They'd take over the facilities, manage the population, bill the state per head. In 1983, the Corrections Corporation of America, CCA, was founded in Nashville. By 1984, they were operating their first facility. By the late 1980s, they were national. In 1994, CCA went public on the New York Stock Exchange. GEO Group, their primary competitor, followed. Incarceration was now a traded asset. And traded assets have one requirement above all others: growth. Here is the business problem that nobody talks about. Private prison contracts typically include occupancy guarantees. Governments agree, in writing, to keep facilities filled to a minimum percentage of capacity, often 80, 90, sometimes 95%. If the population drops below that threshold, the government pays the difference anyway. The private prison doesn't need crime to go up. It needs the prison population to go up. Those are two different things. The American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC, is a policy organization based in Washington, D.C. It brings together state legislators and corporate representatives to draft model legislation, meaning corporations write laws. Legislators take them home and introduce them. Among ALEC's funders, CCA, GEO Group. Among the legislation they championed, truth in sentencing laws, requiring offenders to serve a minimum 85% before parole eligibility, and three strikes laws, mandating life sentences for a third felony conviction, regardless of severity. This is not disputed. It is documented. It is on the public record. The private prison industry funded an organization that wrote laws designed to keep people in prison longer. The prisons filled, the stocks went up. Now layer in the racial dimension. The war on drugs, escalated dramatically by Reagan through the 1980s, targeted crack cocaine with specific ferocity. Under the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, crack carried sentences 100 times harsher than powder cocaine for equivalent quantities. Same drug, different form. 100-to-1 sentencing disparity. Despite research consistently showing white Americans use drugs at comparable or higher rates, black Americans were incarcerated for drug offenses at 10 times the rate. 10 times. By the late 1990s, the U.S. prison population had more than quadrupled since 1970. 2 million people incarcerated, 2/3 of them people of color. The infrastructure was in place. The prisons were built, funded, legally protected, contractually guaranteed occupancy. They needed filling. Now someone needed to help with the culture. Hip-hop did not begin as entertainment. It began as testimony. Grandmaster Flash and the Furious 5 release The Message, a documentary set to a beat about what it actually feels like to live inside the system we just described. For the first decade of its mainstream existence, hip-hop is political by nature. Public Enemy, KRS-One, A Tribe Called Quest, De La Soul. These artists aren't making music, they're making arguments. And then something shifts. Gangster rap did not come from nowhere. NWA's Straight Outta Compton dropped in 1988. The genre was real, documenting real conditions in real cities. But through the late 1980s and into the early 1990s, conscious rap and gangster rap coexist. Neither dominates. Then the industry starts making choices. Death Row Records launches in 1991. Interscope becomes its distributor. Dr. Dre, Snoop Dogg, Tupac. The music is extraordinary. That's not the argument. The argument is about what gets pushed and what doesn't. For every Death Row act getting major label backing and MTV rotation, conscious rap acts can't get a meeting. Too Short, who later spoke publicly about this period, has described label conversations where executives told him what kind of music they wanted, what was hot, what they'd support. It's not that they made artists write different lyrics, it's that they decided which artists, which records, which directions got the infrastructure behind them. And the infrastructure in the music industry is everything. February 8th, 1996. President Clinton signs the Telecommunications Act, the most significant reform of U.S. communications law since 1934. Before 1996, a single company could own no more than 40 radio stations nationally, no more than 4 in any single market. The Act removes the national cap entirely. Within 18 months, consolidation is effectively complete. Clear Channel, later iHeartMedia, acquires over 1,200 stations. A handful of corporations now control what the majority of Americans hear, and they are making decisions at scale. Not artist by artist, format by format. Conscious rap is not a format. Gangster rap is. By the end of the 1990s, rap is the top-selling genre in America. Over 81 million units annually. The content that dominates? Violence, drug use, criminal lifestyle. The content that's disappeared? Political commentary, systemic critique. Hold that next to what we just laid out. The private prison industry needs a growing population. The radio industry, freshly consolidated, amplifies content glorifying the behaviors the criminal justice system prosecutes. The sentencing laws, written in part by prison industry lobbyists, ensure the consequences are severe and long. Nobody needed to coordinate. The system rewarded the same outcomes regardless. In 2023, Ice Cube sits down with Bill Maher. He's not a conspiracy theorist. He is one of the architects of the genre. He was there.
But they didn't make you write those lyrics.
It's not about making somebody write the lyrics. It's about being there as guardrails to make sure certain songs make it through and certain songs don't.
He says, it's not about making somebody write the lyrics. It's about being there as guardrails, making sure certain songs make it through and certain songs don't. Some records are made by committee. Label guys in a room deciding what's hot, what gets backed, what gets made. Maher pushes back. Ice Cube doesn't retreat. He's not claiming a meeting happened. He's describing a system.
Literally the same people who own the labels own private prisons.
One more layer. While hip-hop was being commercially shaped, it was also being surveilled. The NYPD created a dedicated hip-hop unit. Officers attended shows, tracked artists, built databases of rappers and their affiliations. And in courtrooms across the country, prosecutors began using rap lyrics as criminal evidence. An artist documents what they see. The police treat the documentation as a confession. The culture gets criminalized, and the people inside it are more likely to end up in the facilities that need filling. You didn't need a meeting. The system was already there. So let's go back to April 2012. The letter makes specific claims. A meeting, early 1991. Music executives told their companies had become silent investors in private prisons, told to market music promoting criminal behavior, offered personal stock as incentive. It's detailed. It has the texture of a true account, and it has never been verified. No names, no documents, no corroboration from anyone claiming to have been in that room. NPR's Louder Than a Riot investigated carefully. Hip-hop scholar Regina Bradley was direct. The document itself was not evidence. The letter should not be treated as a primary source.
It's not real, folks. It's propaganda.
She was not dismissing the connection between hip-hop and mass incarceration. She was dismissing the letter. There is a difference. Because here is what the letter gets right, even if it's fiction. Every structural condition it describes actually existed. Private prisons were publicly traded. The same institutional investment vehicles that held media company stock also held prison company stock. Not because of conspiracy, but because of how financial markets work. Index funds, pension funds. The people who profited from mass incarceration and the people who profited from gangster rap's commercial dominance were, in many cases, the same class of investor. Not in a room together, in the same portfolios. The letter imagined a meeting. The reality was something more diffuse, more legal, and harder to prosecute. Aligned incentives don't require coordination, they just require a system that rewards certain outcomes. The question hasn't gone away, because the numbers haven't changed. The United States has 5% of the world's population and 25% of its prison population. People of color make up 37% of the American population. They make up 67% of its incarcerated population. That disparity is not explained by crime rates. The research is consistent on this. It is explained by arrest rates, charging decisions, sentencing disparities, and the compounding weight of a system structured legally, economically, politically, to produce exactly this outcome. The conspiracy theory asks whether someone planned it. The documented record asks something harder. Does it matter? If the outcome of an uncoordinated system is identical to a coordinated one, if the prisons fill, the stocks rise, the music promotes the lifestyle, the people go to jail, then the question of intent starts to feel less urgent than the question of structure. The meeting may be myth. The machine was real. It was always there. Backroom publishes new episodes every week on this channel. If this one made you think, share it with someone who should hear it. We'll see you in the next one.